Hello, everybody. If you could take your seats, please. So, welcome back. We're going to go straight into the second session. We've got four very interesting speakers covering many different areas of discussion around speeding interventions at home and abroad. And please don't forget to share your thoughts on social media with at RSA Ireland and using the hashtag #RSAConf2022. So our first speaker for this second session is from Norway. Guro Ranes is Director of Road Traffic Safety at the Norwegian Public Roads Administration. She'll now speak to us on the Norwegian experience in tackling speeding, where I understand it has been very effective. So, Guro.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you on a very important subject. Speed and speeding is essential. Tackling speed is essential to reducing the number of fatal and serious accidents on our roads. And let's hope this is working. Now, next please. Thank you. Next please. Yeah. As in Norway, like Ireland, we have a Vision Zero, and it was adopted by Parliament way back in 2001. So we have worked with the Vision Zero as our guideline now for more than 20 years. And we had our 20th anniversary in the midst of the pandemic, and we really had great plans to make a big event about it. Because of the pandemic, it was a small one and all virtual. So we didn't have the opportunity to renew our commitment to the vision, but still it's very much in front of our work. Next, please. I just like to go shortly into how we are working, and then I will talk on speed afterwards. The way we are working with Vision Zero is the ethics. No number is above zero is really acceptable. If we say it's acceptable with a higher number than zero, who will that be? Which it's acceptable to lose in traffic crashes. It could be someone very close to me, and I don't want that. And then it's the evidence-based approach, and I hear when I listen to the speakers previously, it's high on the agenda, also on this conference. If you want to have success, you have to do it evidence-based. Otherwise, it will only be a flash and you will be proven wrong. And then it's the third pillar, which is the shared responsibility. Me, as an individual, of course, I have a great responsibility because of the position and the administration I am representing. We have a lot of resources and have to do our job to reducing the number of fatalities and serious injuries on the road. At the same time, I'm a citizen, I'm a road user, and I have also an obligation to do my part when I'm not at work. I will keep the speed, I will drive not under the influence, and I will use my seatbelts all the time. I'll do my very best to not break the rules. And I expect everyone else to do the same. Next, please. Try again. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, thank you. And also I would point out that road safety and Vision Zero is also very high on the agenda in Parliament and in the government in general. The Norwegian Public Roads Administration, our goal is to deliver an efficient, safe and environmentally friendly transport system in 2050. It's a long way, but still. And on that journey, we have 5 top goals, and Vision Zero is one of them. So it's not me and my department that's working with the road safety. It's the whole organization, which also includes those working with infrastructure, those working with vehicle safety, and also those working with licensing of new drivers, and also the controls of both the drivers and the vehicles. So everyone has to deliver on this goal. And also, as I heard you in Ireland, you have set an ambition for 2050, and also the Parliament in Norway, they don't declare it a goal. They say it's an ambition to have 0 death on our roads in 2050. And I think it's an important ambition to have, because if we don't start now, what will the roads look like in 2050 if we don't start to do the right thing right now? And we know we have already had great progress. I think you have to help me. No, that's, yeah, okay. One more, thank you. Just a short overview of how we are working. It's very similar to the way of working in Ireland, I understand. We have our Vision Zero on the top. We have our interim targets. Both of them are adopted by Parliament, so it's on high level. Then we have our key performance indicators covering a wide range of areas, including speed. And we have our proven measures and best practice, which both in infrastructure, vehicle, road user activities, controls and enforcement. And then the last one, which is also extremely important, it's the follow-up. Measuring whether or not it's going the way you like, and if not, you have to revise your activities, increase your efforts, or maybe introduce some new activities or measures. Next, please. Just also a short presentation of the developments we have had in Norway. The blue line is the fatalities and seriously injured, and the red line is the fatalities. Last year we had an all-time low in fatalities in Norway, 80 killed on our roads. The population of Norway is 5.4, so quite similar to Ireland. That's extremely low, because this year we have had a really setback. And already this year we have 99 fatalities. So this will be a bad year. But trends the last months, it looks like the trends has turned and the peak is behind us. Regarding the interim target line for fatalities and seriously injured, we are still slightly above that one. So we are not, we are on our way, but it's going to be quite difficult to reach the targets within 2030. Next, please. And I will just talk some about research that we have, that was made a couple of years ago, which we try to figure out how we could explain the decrease in the number of fatality, which has been significant. And the researchers, they said that with significant, they could say for quite sure that they could identify that 59% of the reduction can be explained, and 41% it's unexplained, and It's not like that 41% is a black box. We know quite a lot about what's in that box, but it's hard to prove beyond that. Next one. This is the one that I think is most interesting. It's of those 59% that can be explained, these are the elements, and 2 of them is of particular importance regarding speed, and it's the 2 biggest one. It's the one, of course, with the yellow one, with the 22% of the fatalities or the reduction can be explained by lower speed. And lower speed in this context is the road user compliance, that I as a road user keep the speed limits and the measures necessary to make me do that. But also the road improvements element is of interest, because within that element is the way we are setting the speed limits. So first you have to set the right speed limits, the appropriate speed limits, and then it's to get road users to keep those speed limits. Both of them are of importance. Next, please. Thank you. In Norway, we have the 2 general speed limits. I think it's quite common around the world. 80 kilometers an hour on rural roads and 50 kilometers an hour on our urban roads. The picture you see on the lower left, I think it's taken in the 60s. It was not unusual. Today it's outrageous to see such an environment for a child. So a lot have changed. We have guidelines and recommendation of how to set speed limits when you're not using 80 or 50. And in the lower range, we say that urban roads, in general, we say 40 kilometers is acceptable. If there are a lot of high activity of vulnerable road users and close to schools and that sort of things, the speed limit should be 30. And it's quite common in Norway, and it's been for a long time. So the 30 kilometers per hour speed limit is widely used and accepted. 40 kilometers an hour is mainly used for roads carrying buses and through traffic with separation of vulnerable road users, or the activity is not that high. Then we have rural roads without a medium barrier. That's the vast majority of roads in Norway, and I guess also in Ireland. The general speed limit is 80. But we have guidelines that makes us identify the most high-risk routes. And if we find that the risk is very unusually high, we set the speed limit as 70. So we have done that in 2 rounds in 2001 and 2011. And our experience of doing this is very good. You reduce the number of serious accidents significantly, and it's starting to be accepted also by the public, because they know that when the speed limit is not 80, which is the general speed limit, when it's 70, it's for a reason. It's not by chance, it's because it's the safe speed. And then we also use 60 kilometers an hour on some roads, usually close to when we are coming closer to built-up areas, industrial and factories, and with a low proportion of vulnerable road users. And then we have our highways with medium barriers. All the new highways in Norway, they have 110 kilometers an hour as speed limit, but some of our older highways, motorways, have either 90 or 100. But it's a principle that if you are going to have speed limits above 80 kilometers an hour, the general speed limit outside urban area, there has to be a medium barrier. because if you get a head-on collision in such high speeds, the outcome will most likely be fatal. Next, please. Thank you. We are monitoring the development of the speed on our roads, and the compliance with the speed limits are slowly but steadily going in the right direction. And it's a lot of reasons for this, both the policing and also our speed campaigns. I will talk a bit more about this later. We had a dip in the pandemic. We're not quite sure why, but in 2020 the compliance went down. In last year it was up again. We will not be able to reach a target for this year, but I am hopeful. But it is ambitious to reach a compliance of 72% compliance by 2026, which is our KPI target for speed. But as I said initially, being successful managing speed is essential if you want to reach your overall targets. Next, please. Like you, in Norway, we have a national plan of action. The one we are in the period we are within now is from 2022 to 2025. I have some copies with me, which I will leave here, if a short version in English. The measures targeting speed, they are mostly the police or the Norwegian Public Roads Administration who are responsible for these targets. We have a very good cooperation with the police. I understand you have the same here in Ireland, and especially regarding speed, that's key to success. The cooperation between the enforcement on the road by the police and the education and the campaign and the building of knowledge to the population and the road user by other actors together, that's the way you have success. I think I will go to the next one, not going in detail to those. Regarding speed enforcement, as I said, the police is vital. In Norway we have special traffic police which are doing most of the speed controls on our rural roads. They are both uniform and civilian cars driving, so it's a point to be visual on the road, so that the road users recognize that someone is monitoring the speeds on the road. That calms the traffic down. But also we want to have civilian cars with the police to be able to track down those who are difficult to reach otherwise. We also have average speed control, and those are extremely efficient if you put them up on stretches where you do have problems with the speed or the consequences of crashes are high. And the picture is from one over many tunnels. So a lot of our section average speed controls are in tunnels, but also on our main roads. The studies we have done shows that it reduces the number of fatalities and serious injuries by 50%. So it's very efficient. I'll also say something about how we use our graduated speed penalties, since I recognize that this is a subject of discussion also in Ireland. Earlier today it was announced that the fines, general fines, is 160 euros. I just looked up what in Norway what the fines are in Norway, and they are high. If you drive 6 to 10 kilometers above the speed limit, it's roughly 230 euros. 11 to 15, 415. 16 to 20 kilometers above the speed limit, 600 euros. And 21 to 25, 930 euros. You're smiling and laughing, that's okay. In addition, you have penalty points. In the lower ranges, it's 2 penalty points. In the higher ranges, it's 3 penalty points. And for novice drivers, it's double penalty points. As a novice driver, you may be caught once. The second time, you are over the limit of 8, and you lose your license. And also the fines, they also vary, some with the lower and higher speed limits. It's a matrix. The next one. We also have quite some activity regarding campaigns. Both signs alongside the road. This is an example. Well, it's, the text is, of course, in Norwegian. It's saying over the speed limit, question mark, and a gentle reminder to the road user to watch the speed. We also have campaigns with films in television and in social media and other places where we can put advertisements. The point made by the last speaker saying that one argument is everybody is speeding. And that's not true. And that's a basis for our last campaign. We are telling the road users that if you keep the speed, you are in the majority. Those who speed, they are in the minority. And if you want to be in the majority doing the right thing, keep on doing what you're doing, keep the speed limit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guro. And clearly, Norway is not a good place to speed. People can't afford it. I think it's interesting, some countries have higher fines for high-income people as well, which obviously we heard earlier, I think, that richer people in more expensive cars tend to speed more. And I think Finland had some notable examples of huge fines for high-income individuals. Anyway, we'll move on. So next is Rod King, MBE, founder and campaign director at the UK-based not-for-profit 20s Plenty for Us. Rod.
Thank you. Yes, that's us. Let's move on. Really, thank you for inviting me to talk here. I always like to say, look, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Who'd want someone from the UK telling them what to do? But maybe I can talk about what's happening elsewhere, and yeah, I'll try and move on because I want to leave some good time for questions at the end. First of all, there's some ideas. How do we share equitably and safely the public spaces between buildings that we call streets? And sometimes we forget about that definition of streets and roads. How do speed limits question our values, rights, and justice of citizens in our communities? And is a 50-kilometre-per-hour speed limit that was set decades ago appropriate for 21st century community needs around mobility and independence? Right, so what I'm going to cover, who are 20s Plenty, love 30, why 30 kilometres per hour is a default urban village speed limit, who's setting 30 kilometres per hour as a default, that question about should 30 kilometre per hour limits be exceptions or should they be put in as default or norm, how Wales is setting a national 20 mile an hour, 30 kilometre per hour urban village limit, and how to maximise success in adoption of 20 mile an hour limits. So this is who we are, what we do. We have over 650 local campaigns since starting in 2007. Please read all that. But basically, we help politicians do the right thing. And sometimes they need an awful lot of help. But I'm pleased to say that on this particular aspect of 20-mile-an-hour limits, we're very much succeeding in that. So why 30 kilometers per hour as a default? Well, look, it's about physics and biology in any language. And that is why it's very much being adopted as a universal. Right, okay. Right, we're back there. Yes, any language. We know the stats. I'm not going to go in the evidence because you can get the evidence. It's all out there from the WHO, from the UN, from places which have implemented 30 kilometers per hour limits. There's the physics. That actually accelerating up to 50 kilometers per hour uses twice as much energy as accelerating to 30 kilometers per hour. And every time we accelerate up to that speed limit in an urban environment, we're using twice as much fuel, emitting twice as much emissions as we would if it was capped at 30 kilometers per hour. And that's a very important consideration. If only drivers would have one of these controlling their cars, they'd all go a lot slower, wouldn't they? Right. And of course, cars are getting bigger, but children aren't. An 8-year-old is the same size now as they were in 1920. So really, we've got to take that into account, and we've got to look at those streets in the perspective of the 8-year-old child rather than the 48-year-old motorist. So, 3 reasons, let's recap on those. Globally, there are 1.4 million road fatalities every year. And this was really impressive. This is 4,000 pairs of shoes, the number of people who die on the roads every day, right, which was shown at Stockholm in 2020. Secondly, there is a global climate emergency. And lower speed limits and reducing our dependence on motor vehicles is key in addressing that. And finally, look, we all want our places to be better places to be. We want our children to be able to walk and cycle to school. We want our elderly to keep on walking. We want to relax outside of shops, on the streets, when we're walking and cycling. We want those to be better places to be. And that's a key driver, right, to change towards lower speed limits. So, big step was the 3rd Global Ministerial Conference on Road Safety in Stockholm in 2020. And out of that came the Stockholm Declaration, which was to mandate a maximum road travel speed of 30 kilometers per hour where vulnerable road users and vehicles mix in a frequent and planned manner, except where strong evidence exists that higher speeds are safe. And what that means is you default to 30 kilometers per hour and you make conscious decisions about where it should be higher. And that became globally endorsed by the UN. And we can see the root of that involvement. 2017, before that, the UN Global Road Safety Week chose Save Lives, Slow Down, right, as its theme. There was a Stockholm Declaration in 2020. There was the UN Global Road Safety Week last year, had the theme, the single theme, Streets for Life and 30 kilometers per hour. And of course, it's been embedded into the 2nd decade of road action from the UN. But you know, 30 kilometers per hour limits are not a silver bullet for climate change reduction or anything else. But they provide a foundation for so many things. Transport carbon reduction, active travel, movement equality, livability in communities, public health. And it's when you expand expand if you like, looking at the benefits which can come from lower speeds, that you actually see that it ticks far more boxes than just that of the Transport Minister. It affects public health, it affects so many things which are crucial to making our society better places to be for all residents. So, and I pose this question: what sort of climate emergency response do you have if adding a few minutes to motor journeys is considered too difficult? If the intervention which make a difference to climate change is what you're considering, and then you say, oh, it might upset the motorists, I don't know whether we can do that. What sort of response is that? If you're credible about climate emergency, then you really have to do something about the speed of traffic in those public spaces which are shared with people in and outside of motor vehicles. So, who's setting 30 kilometres per hour as a default? UK history of 20-mile-an-hour limits. From 2006, there was a change in guidance, and we had the first citywide 20-mile-an-hour implementation in Portsmouth, followed by Oxford. We had the first London Borough implementation in Islington, and we had the first town-wide implementation in Warrington, which is where I come from, still am. But by 2010, there was less than 1 million people in the UK lived in 20-mile in authorities where 20-mile-an-hour is the default. And now we move on to 2022. There was another change in guidance in 2013 from the government, but by 2022, the majority of the 40 largest urban authorities in the UK had 20-mile-an-hour for most of their urban and village roads. Many shower counties, Lancashire, Cornwall, now Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, all setting 20-mile-an-hour for most towns, for most roads in towns and villages. All inner London boroughs, you'll find 20-mile-an-hour is the norm, and a lot of the arterial roads in London as well. The capital cities of Edinburgh and Cardiff. Wales has set a national urban 20-mile-an-hour limit from September 23, and I'll go into that a little bit later. And Scotland plans to do so by 2024. Now, 28 million, 43% of UK population have or planned to get 20-mile-an-hour as their norm in their authority. And of course, there's more coming all the time. And of course, that's happening across Europe as well. It's not a UK thing, it's a Europe thing, it's a global thing. In the US, 25-mile-an-hour residential speed limits are being reduced to 20. So in September 2020, Bilbao set 30 kilometers per hour. Last year, Spain set 30 kilometers per hour as the national urban default for where there were one lane in each direction. Brussels has done it, Paris has done it, many French towns. You go to Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland. It's the norm for towns and villages. And often these include major arterial roads, 6-lane carriageways, where because there are pedestrians and cyclists and the need to reduce noise and reduce emissions, then 30 kilometers per hour limits have been chosen. So, casualty reductions in practice. Well, in UK authorities, 30 to 40% fewer casualties in Calderdale, Bath, 23% fewer casualties, Cheshire West and Cheshire, recently 43%, Edinburgh, 33% fewer casualties. And across EU locations as well, Brussels 19%, Bilbao 24%, Helsinki 0 fatalities, Oslo a year with 0 pedestrian and cyclist fatalities, Spain a reduction of 20% in fatalities. And let's look at those Spanish figures. And this was after a national implementation, right? 20% reduction in all fatalities, 17% fewer motorcycle fatalities. I've got this wrong, that's a typo, it should say motorcycle, by the way. My translation of motoristas was not very good. But 34% fewer cyclist fatalities, 31% fewer elderly fatalities, and 26% fewer pedestrian fatalities. All because that change was made in May 2021 to a national 30 kilometers per hour limit. And interesting, the ETSC made a call recently for 30 kilometers per hour to each of the EU countries. Greece replies that its national strategic plan will include the establishment of a maximum speed of 30 kilometers per hour for urban residential. Latvia, Denmark, 30 kilometers per hour in many places. Netherlands replied, we've already done this, right? And Spain had set the default, Slovenia as well, Luxembourg, Estonia, Spain. Unfortunately, Ireland did not reply. Right, so we don't have any knowledge of exactly how what Ireland said to the ETSC because they didn't do so. One of the outcomes from that was Antonio Venosa, the executive director of the European Transport Safety Council, said, and here, yeah, the law of physics, they apply equally to every EU member. It's something which there are no opt-outs, right? And he said that there can be absolutely no justification today for default urban limits of 50 kilometers per hour where motorized traffic mixes with pedestrians and cyclists. And I think that's a very clear statement from the ETSC on the benefits, right, and the requirement for 30 kilometers per hour. So, should 30 kilometers per hour be set as an exception or as the norm? Well, if you take the approach of 50 kilometers per hour everywhere, but only in some places slow down to 30 kilometers per hour, it's a very strong message that endorses 50 kilometers per hour on most streets. It maintains high emissions from stop-start driving. Because you've only got a few exceptions from the norm, you might need physical calming to counter that norm. And then it becomes 30 times to 50 times more expensive to do. Right? 30 around schools addresses the perceived danger rather than actual danger to pupils. You just have a go faster sign 100 meters past the school. You give safety to those who are driven into the school safety zone, but you leave 50 kilometers per hour and faster speeds for the largest part of the pupil journey when they're walking and cycling. 50 kilometers per hour as a norm maintains the hegemony of the motor car and prioritises motorists and drivers above the people who are walking and cycling. But change that round. Set 30 kilometers per hour as your norm, i.e. we go 30 kilometers per hour everywhere, and we go faster only where it's safe. It endorses a new norm on sharing space with pedestrians and cyclists. It provides you with the opportunity for population-wide engagement, assisting that behaviour change. Rather than local authority or a town have to do it, if you like, local authority by local authority, saying, look, we're going to slow down in Cork or we're going to slow down in Sligo. Right. You're actually saying, no, based on Irish values, based on our national values, we're going to have a new norm where we're using those public spaces. It's far more cost effective. You get a less reduction than if you have physical calming, but you have a far wider effect. And those are maximised across the network. Less road danger, fewer emissions, less noise, greater priority to active and sustainable travel. You increase mobility, equity, and you end that hegemony of the motor car and prioritisation. Very symbolically, you're saying, in our towns and villages, these public spaces where we have people walking and cycling, we are putting those people first, And sorry, it's a little bit slower, it's a little bit more inconvenient, but you know it's going to be a whole lot better for everybody. So how is Wales doing it? Well, they're putting livability first. They're the first UK nation to set a national 20-mile-an-hour limit. They're changing the default speed limit from 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour for all lit roads. So the key thing there is that there is street lighting. They've already legislated for that change, which is actually going into effect on 17th of September 2023. Now they're going through the process of working with local authorities to make all the necessary changes. There's a planned community and publicity programme for it. They're using geomapping to allow local authorities to identify potential exceptions. And there should be exceptions, where there's no housing, where there's no schools, no social buildings, where there's a 30 mile an hour limit and it doesn't have any of those, or you have good segregated provision for pedestrians and crossing provisions and also for cyclists, then there can and should be exceptions. Increased resources for police to enforce, plus automated enforcement. And it's supported by Public Health Wales, Institute for Welsh Affairs, Children's Commission, Future Generations Commission, Active Travel Act, and cross-party support. This is key to widen the beneficiaries far beyond those road safety. It's not just about road casualties. It is, right, about road casualties, but it's about those other things as well. Right. And it set up a task group in 29 to establish how to implement, not whether, how we're going to do this. So it was from the government a clear mandate. We want to do this. Let's find out the best way to do it. And that was where they put a task group together. And that came out with a report in July 2020, which covered 21 recommendations, legislation, policy, exceptions, enforcement, etc. And then got that in the Welsh Parliament, got cross-party support to actually say, go ahead, we're going to do that. How to maximise success? The biggest mistake is to think it's about traffic engineering. It's about marketing and engagement to get that social behaviour change. You put it into the context of huge community and society benefits. You provide value-based benefits to compliers. So people can see that if I comply, then I can feel good about complying. This is something which is me giving something to the community. You depersonalize it, right? And but you enable people to feel good about complying and making that policy work to make their places better places. You develop a multi-agency collaborative team. It's not just about transport. It's about public health, it's about education, it's about social services, about emergency services. All of these people saying we're for this and we like this. We think it's going to make a big difference. You involve and be inclusive of all sectors, even if they disagree. You bust the myths, challenge the opposing views, you quantify issues and turn them into benefits. You create that social norm that people love 30, where they live, they learn, they work, and they shop. And that's the engagement which is about memes like this: Bristol's better at 20, we love our streets, and 20's plenty. Will Ireland be next with a default 30 kilometres per hour? Is your current 30 kilometres per hour practice too slow to implement, too cumbersome, too isolated? Is there no consistency in setting speed limits? Are there minimal guidelines? Do your isolated 30 kilometre per hour limits endorse higher speeds everywhere else? As the world has moved forward with 30 kilometres per hour as best practice, why not implement nationally? Far cheaper than isolated limits, It's far more consistent. You can have centralized engagement and publicity and set that new norm for the sharing of those public spaces we call streets. The inescapable fact is it is illogical for governments, national governments, to retain a national urban limit of 50 kilometres per hour and then urge all local authorities and cities to change it to 30 kilometres per hour on most roads because the national limit is considered inappropriate. That is completely illogical and a waste of public resources. Final question. If you defer the implementation of a 30 kilometres per hour limit for most urban and village roads, how many people will be killed or injured as a consequence in that time? How much will active travel be suppressed as a result? And how will you ever meet your climate change commitments? So, Streets for Health, Streets for Climate, Streets for People, really work together and get those streets for life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rod, for making the case for 30 not to be the exception, but the default, and providing the evidence to justify that. Next we're going to hear from Alastair De Beer, Head of Road Safety at Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and his colleague, Dr. Suzanne Mead, Road Safety Engineer, also at TII. They're going to take us through the effectiveness of engineering measures to reduce speed on Ireland's roads. Alastair and Suzanne.
I'll try and speak quickly so you can hear Suzanne. She's got more interesting slides than mine. First I have to work out how to use this clicker.
If it doesn't work, you can just ask them to move the slides.
Okay. Can you go back one? Okay, so I'm firstly going to talk about TI's role in safe speeds and infrastructure's role in safe speeds, and look at a bit of the collision data on the National Road Network and the trends that we're having. And then Suzanne's just going to go through the different infrastructure measures that we've put in place to try and reduce speeds on the National Road Network. Okay, so as I said, I'll be doing part one. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, just put a bit of perspective on the National Road Network. The National Road Network, as you can see on the map over there, is the motorways, the national primary roads, and the national secondary roads across the country. And then if you go to the next slide. So on the National Road Network, it's only 5.3% of all the kilometres of the network in Ireland. So we've got about 100,000 kilometres of road network in Ireland, and the National Road Network is only 5.3% of that network. However, we've got 45% of all traffic on the National Road Network, and 90% of all freight uses the National Road Network. So that the bottom one, the 90% of all freight, is quite a, it's the number that we need to look at. It's building bypasses around towns and getting those 90% of freight out of villages and towns, and then it'll be easier to implement the 30 kph. From a point of view of fatalities, we have 37% of the fatalities occur on the National Road Network and 21% of serious injuries. So it's the relative terms of serious injuries is quite small compared to the percentage of the traffic. If you want to go to the next slide. So this slide is just to demonstrate the different sorts of roads we have on the network. We've got motorways, you've got dual carriageways, you've got the national secondaries and primary roads, and then you've got urban towns and villages on the National Road Network too. So we both have to look at the high-speed intercity roads, and we also have to look at the urban roads. And then, of course, we have the legacy roads, like the picture on the bottom there, the N71. These roads haven't been designed to any design speed. They haven't been designed to any design standard. Yet we're expecting people to drive 100 kph on those roads, as well as the the national primary routes. Okay, so next slide. So this is just a quick percentage of the network. So 20% of the network is 120, and 90% of the network is rural, and only 10% is in the urban areas. Okay, next slide. So TI is part of the national, as part of the road safety strategy. We're looking at the Action 8, which is implementing periodic speed limits at schools, vehicle-activated signage, average speed cameras, and so Suzanne's going to go through a few of those in the next slide. Sorry, in the next slide, but if you can go back one. Sorry. So TI's strategic objectives are to deliver TI's actions in the road safety strategy and to invest money in where collisions are taking place, and then also trying to work out where collisions are going to take place and invest money in those areas too. So now you can go to the next slide. Okay, so within TI, we have the road safety section. It's where myself and Suzanne are based. And our aim is to reduce collisions on the national road network. Our primary legislation we follow is the European Directive, which looks at different criteria, proactively, reactively. We also have to monitor road safety audits on the network, road safety impact assessments, and then also traffic management in roadworks. So next slide. And that's just showing the 7 pillars of the road safety strategy and where speed. So TI is involved in the safe roads and roadsides, safe speed, and we're also involved in safe and healthy modes of transport. So next slide. So I'll quickly run through a few of TI's safety performance indicators, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is a very interesting slide. 43% of all fatalities on the national road network are as a result of head-on collisions. So I think earlier speaker was mentioning about single carriageway roads, and in Norway, where you have all the single carriageway roads are 80 to try and reduce the amount of head-on collisions. So the head-on collisions obviously are not happening on the motorways. Okay, some do happen on the motorways, but they're luckily very small percentage. But those 43%, majority of them are happening on rural roads. So these are the things we need to look at. And then we have vehicle-to-vehicle collisions at 22%. And then non-motorized users are quite relatively low on the national road network, but that's what you expect considering we only have 10% of the urban network. But just there at the bottom, you can see what the impact is of being in these sort of collisions. So if you're involved in a collision as a pedestrian, you've got a 90% chance of being injured. As a cyclist, you've got about an 80% chance of being injured. And if you're involved in a head-on collision, you've got about a 55% chance of being injured. So if we go on to the next slide. Yes, that's just 2. Okay. This slide here is just something I wanted to point out. I mentioned the fact that we had 43% of fatalities were as a result of head-on collisions on the motorway on the national road network. However, if you look at those 43% of collisions, there were 31 fatalities, 23 people were seriously injured, and 17 people were minor injuries within those collisions. So it wasn't only 31 people that were affected by those collisions. There were 71 people altogether within those cars. So when you do have a head-on collision, you end up with a lot of fatalities and a lot of serious injuries. So it's one of the primary collision types that we need to focus on within the on the TI's network. And speed would be a majority of those collisions would be as a result of speed. Next slide. Okay. This just to demonstrate the motorway network is by far the safest network that we have. It's 5 times safer than a single carriageway network. So although people on the motorway network are going at speed at 120 kilometers per hour, they're still a lot safer than people driving at 100 kilometers per hour on the single carriageway network. So speed in itself is not the factor which is causing collisions. It's inappropriate speed on the roads. So driving at 60 or 50 in an urban area is perhaps an inappropriate speed. Driving at 100 on a single carriageway road might be an inappropriate speed, but and driving 120 on a motorway might be an appropriate speed. But that's just to point out that's not speed itself, it's inappropriate speed that we need to focus on. So next slide. The construction of the motorway network, we've increased the amount of dual carriageways from 400 kilometers in 2008 to over 995 kilometers in 2021. And during that time, the fatality rate in Ireland has fallen from 254 down to 136. That's not all because of the motorway networks. Obviously, it's a lot of other factors too. The go-safe cameras, the extra laws on alcohol. But it's kind of a large portion of that would be because of reducing the amount of head-on collisions, getting people out of towns and villages onto the motorway network. Next slide. So to do our work and to focus on where we want to do road safety, we need to have data available, we need to have new standards, we need to collaborate with the Gardaí and with the Road Safety Authority, and we need to look at new techniques such as average speed cameras. If you want to, next slide. This is just an important slide, that if we can just reduce the speed by 5% on some of our roads, we could reduce fatalities by 30%. That's from the WHO. So although we're going to maybe reduce the speed to 30 kilometers per hour in an urban area, you're not going to get everyone to drive 30 kilometers per hour, but if you manage to get even a 5% reduction in that speed of those vehicles, we could be reducing the fatalities greatly. Next slide. Okay, so as I said earlier, now I'll let Suzanne now go through a few of the different measures that we have introduced on the National Road Network and what effect they had.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Just going to see if this will work. It does. Okay, for now. So what I'm going to talk about in the next part of this presentation is 5 interventions that we have rolled out across the network. The slide here just illustrates how we are looking at that in terms of a safe systems lens. So around the outside, we've developed new standards. In terms of data and research, we collect those across the network. That allows us to monitor and evaluate what's happening on the network. New innovations as we see them coming along, we'll talk about that on our network. The implementation and the influence of new regulations and how we support that. Funding and resourcing, of course, and as Alistair mentioned, a collaboration with our stakeholders. So this is all brought together to what we're talking about today, which is safe speed. So I'm going to look at 5 things that we have on our network at the moment. Transition zones in towns and villages. I'm not going to talk about network safety analysis, but we do that. We've been doing that for several years, and that is the foundation of how we decide when and where and what to implement, and it allows us to know that what we're implementing will have an impact because we monitor after as well, and I'll talk about that in some of these slides. So transition zones, vehicle activated signs, average speed cameras, which are new, variable speed limits, which are new, and periodic speed limits on our network. So in terms of safe systems and safe speeds, I'm going to talk about those, and they all sit under the heading of Action 8, Expand Management Measures. Next slide, please. So transition zones in towns and villages. So already we've heard from Velma's presentation earlier the extent to which people believe and do speed in our urban areas. So about 52% according to recent research carried out by the RSA. So we have taken that on board and some of our own research. Next slide, please. So TII conducted traffic calming implementation across 91 sites across 23 counties in Ireland. So we looked at the frequency before and after of collisions at those sites. So traffic calming the aim of that was to reduce speed. Next slide, please. So the impact on collisions. So after, there was a global reduction of 13%. and all injuries. There was a 52% in fatal collisions and serious injuries, minor collisions by 9%. And also, you'll watch the one there that I've highlighted on head-on collisions, which Alistair referred to, and that dropped by nearly 30%. So across our network, we've somewhere in the region of 30 to 40% of all collisions are a head-on collision. And down at the bottom, pedestrian collisions dropped by about 13%. So that's in and around the range of how many cyclist and pedestrian collisions we have on the network. It's slightly lower than the national average, as Alistair explained. Next slide, please. So what does this do? So we took that information and we changed our standards. We came up with a new standard in conjunction with DEMERS. Just hit the next slide there and just keep going. There's one or two. Yeah, so what we did was introduced a new standard in 2018 called the treatment of gateways, transition zones in towns and villages. So what we're talking about here is going from a high-speed situation into what should be a low-speed situation. So how do we get the drivers to do that? Next slide, please. So there's a number of elements of treating that. Just hit the next slide there again. There you go, and the next one. Thank you. So what we need to do is elicit a behaviour change through what the road actually looks like. So before, without treatment, the driver will see it and go, it looks rural, I don't need to slow down. But actually, they could in fact be somewhere that's posted at 50 or 60. So if it doesn't look like it, the driver isn't going to actually change their behaviour. So what we want to do is on the road in front of the driver that it has changed to a street or an urban environment. So change the visual message that they're seeing. Next slide, please. Next slide, say it again. Yeah, so one of the full examples that we have will be going to site next year. It's in Grange Mockler. So this is a full implementation of a gateway entry treatment in accordance with that standard. So it means that the core of that village should be a very, very low speed environment, 50 or 30. So the results of that should come in when that is built. Next slide, please. Just go again. So they're defined areas within it. So you're telling the driver you're definitely in a rural area. Then we've got the transition zone. It's changing the visual element of what the driver, the feedback they get about their environment until they're into the village core. And that is where pedestrians and cyclists are, and they should be a guest. So next slide, please. So the next one is vehicle activated signs. Next slide, please. So these are implemented where we have a known isolated hazard. So somewhere in a high-speed location, but there's inappropriate speed for the driver to come off safely. So things like loss of control, for example. So before that, we had twice above the average collision rate at these sites. We treated about 5 of them, and after there were no collisions reported at any of these sites. So post-installation. So Sam Wade mentioned earlier that some of these are very fractional, small changes, as did Alistair, but there was only a 2% per hour reduction of speed. So that brought those sites down from twice above to normal collision rates. The limitation to use of that, it's not a panacea for everything. They have to be picked, so again, have to be evidence-based, and they're only used at very specific isolated sites. So the driver gets credible information about, there is a hazard coming up, I need to do something about that, I need to slow down. Next slide, please. Average speed cameras, so these are new. So just going to talk about the Port Tunnel and the M7 implementation there. Next slide. So the aim of these is to encourage drivers to reduce their speed, and the objective is to reduce the frequency and severity of collisions within confined spaces or along a stretch of road. So they also have the added benefit, and Rod spoke about that earlier, there's other policy areas that this benefits, one being climate, the other being public health in the reduction of collisions and emissions. So these needed quite a lot of new systems and investments. So new systems, new collaborations within Garda Síochána, a lot of back office equipment, monitoring and processes, etc. New hardware, software investment, etc. Next slide, please. So this is the results from implementation of the Port Tunnel. Previously in 2013 and then after in 2018. So you can see the change. So above 80, that was reduced significantly, but the percent above 88, which would be excessive speed, was 99.5%, was nearly completely reduced. Next slide, please. So moving on to the M7. So this again is evidence-based. So before these were implemented, TII conducted a lot of research and they looked at the whole section across 7 sites on the M7. They also monitored the weather to see what was going on. They found out that about 40% of drivers were exceeding 120 kilometre speed limit. So that's in line with what Belma had presented earlier. And they also found there was excessive speed. So above 135 kilometres, and in severe weather conditions, normally there's about 10% reaching this excessive speed, but actually in heavy rain, we found that it still was nearly 10%, 8 to 9%. So the weather changing, they still kept on speeding or were speeders. Next slide, please. Okay, and just go again. So after the implementation, you can see there was about 68% of compliance with the speed limit, but then that has risen to 96%. So after the average speed cameras came in, there is an immediate impact that has reduced the speeds and brought them in line with the posted speed limit. Next slide, please. So the impacts on speed. So on the Port Tunnel before, over half were exceeding the posted speed limit, and after that was reduction to just 1 in 8, so about 12%. On the M7, before about a third were exceeding the posted speed limit, and after only about 4%, and 1% were recorded exhibiting excessive speed. So that's down from 10%. Next slide, please. Variable speed limits and lane control. Again, this is a new rollout from Transport Infrastructure Ireland in collaboration with other agencies. So this required new legislation. So that was the Road Traffic Bill 2021. It also required new systems. So the TII EMOS system, enhancing motorway operations. So that all had to be rolled out as well. And public awareness campaign as well in association with Road Safety Authority. Next slide, please. Okay, so there was a phased introduction across that. It expands what was already there in the Dublin Port Tunnel Control Building, deployment of ITS, lane control signals, so the physical infrastructure to make this all happen. And there's a picture of that there. So the variable speed control can go from anything from 100 right down to 30. Next slide, please. So that, as I said before, that needed a lot of investment and new infrastructure, physical infrastructure. You can see the list there. But when is this deployed? So adverse weather, and you can see from my previous example, adverse weather actually doesn't slow people down from what we found. When there's a collision, so this in terms of safe systems, when there's a collision, the post-crash care is very important. So when this is deployed, emergency services can get to the person quicker. Congestion. When that exceeds certain thresholds, and during road works, so when there's maintenance or something has to be done. Next slide, please. The last one I'm going to look at is periodic speed limits at schools. Next slide. So this is an example of one that we have implemented in the N13. It goes from 100 kph, it's a rural school, 100 kph down to 60 while school is in session. The building is located right on the roadside. And next slide, please. So when the periodic speed limit is off, so school is out, 8% of drivers exceeded the 100 kph speed limit, and the average was 88. Interestingly, when the periodic speed limit was turned on, 87% of drivers exceeded the 60 kph posted there. So the maximum speed recorded there was 120 kph, and the average was 78 kilometres per hour. So there is a 10 k per hour reduction overall, but 1%. But still, next slide. So just to recap on what we've covered there, 5 different things. So one thing that's important and what we've looked at from the evidence that we have is credible speed limits encourage drivers to comply with the posted speed limits. So in terms of the transition zones, why is that happening? So communicating credible reasons for low speeds, and then drivers will self-enforce, not applicable everywhere. And vehicle activated signs, they provide credible, targeted information to encourage drivers to reduce their speed at a particular proximity to a particular hazard. Finally, the average speed cameras, they reduce speed violation through enforcement, because there is now a credible chance that speed will be detected. And some of our speakers earlier showed that fear of being detected is one of the influencers of drivers speeding. So inappropriate excessive speeds are found to persist in poor weather. We found that as well. And reducing speed lowers the frequency and severity of avoidable injuries. Thank you very much. Last slide. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much to Alistair and Susanna for telling us about the success of those interventions on the national roads. So the next speaker is Superintendent Sean Fallon from the Gardaí, from the National Roads Policing Bureau. Sean.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious, I suppose, time-wise, I know there's an opportunity for questions at the end, so we'll certainly, there's a lot of experts in the room that probably have better things to tell you today than listening to me, so we will afford the opportunity for the questions. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of the Garda Roads Policing Bureau. And genuinely, when I say I'm happy to be here, I'm delighted because I really thought my opportunity to walk the steps of the Hogan stand, worrying what I was going to say in a speech, that opportunity had passed me by. But it just shows you that you should never give up on your dreams. And thanks very much to Sam and all the team at the RSA for helping me realise mine today. Just, I suppose, on a serious note, it is wonderful to have an opportunity here to speak with the audience. And certainly from Garda Síochána's perspective, it's really good for us to have a forum such as this. I think COVID robbed us of the opportunities to just engage with people, and I think it is really appropriate that we're here in Croke Park. I was explaining to some of the international guests just the significance of Croke Park as a location in Ireland, the historical significance, and I suppose the role of the GA as a community-based organisation. And I was delighted to hear references from Sam and the Minister and other speakers indeed, just about the importance of community. And I think community, and we've had a lot of slides and a lot of statistics, and they're very important, but really, I think it's a really important message, certainly from a Garda Síochána's point of view, is to work with communities. And that's a community of professionals, academics, practitioners, businesses as yourselves, and oversight groups, and all the people that are working collectively and collaboratively to ensure our roads are safe. And particularly the team today, and just to endorse that, whatever AGS can do, we're fully behind our collective efforts in managing speed and indeed the consequences of speed, because unfortunately we see all too often, indeed our members see it up front and personally. I notice people in the room have experienced it on a very personal level, and just the horrific consequences of it. And I think that's not lost on us, certainly. And for all the collective effort, the one piece is, that really our overarching missing in Garda Síochána is to keep people safe, and that's a hugely important piece for us. I suppose just going back to the community piece, and again, Assistant Commissioner Hillman has a portfolio, very enthusiastic and a very authentic leader in the whole area of road safety, and is really to drive on the standards of it. And what we're trying to create, just to give you an overview of the Garda National Roads Policing Bureau, it's something of a hub and spoke model where we sit at the centre and we have a reach then into the various divisions across the country, whereby we would interact with our frontline colleagues on a fairly frequent basis to set around policies and operational orders, and just to set the agenda for what we think where the areas of enforcement should be. And I suppose it's to give some reassurance to that there's approximately 715 Garda personnel are employed on a full-time basis in the roads policing area. That's approximately 5% of our overall force. And that commitment, I suppose, to keeping people safe is a genuine one. As I say, it's one that we take very seriously, and it's not, no more than anything. I think there's real learning in the room for us today, and I think it's really encouraging to hear all the experts in the area and to take the learnings. And I think that's something that Commissioner Hillman has actively encouraged, that if there's best practice there, we're keen to take that on board and to really embrace new ideas and new ways of doing our business. Because, as I say, the important piece for us is we're really proud of 100 years of Garda Síochána serving communities throughout Ireland, and I think that's the resonance of the GA. The GA has a reach into every corner of Ireland, I think, and Garda Síochána does too, and I think there's a real opportunity for us to share that message. And absolutely, I think we take our obligations around enforcement very seriously, but there's also a huge piece as regards engagement and engaging with the communities and where we serve on a fairly frequent basis, and that's an important piece, and I know that's been touched on by other speakers, so the engagement, the education, but absolutely I think there's a recognition where the rubber meets the road, and all of this is where the enforcement needs to come in, and we certainly won't shirk our responsibilities in that regard. So with that in mind, the presentation has 3 areas. I'm going to give you an overview of speeding, the current landscape in particular, where we work very closely with our partners GoSafe, the use of mobility device, which mobility has been transformative from an AGS perspective, and I suppose it's one of our core goals as an organisation is to embrace technologies, and certainly mobility, and the feedback we've gotten again from our frontline members is mobility has been hugely transformative there, and again it's to lever those technologies to make sure just to create efficiencies and to take it has been to be, a troublesome area insofar as from a governance and an oversight, and mobility really has enhanced our ability to just to put a good structure and just efficiencies around it, because I think the reality is, and we're not going to hide behind it, we can't have a policeman in every corner, so we need to use opportunities around technology where we can lever technology to help us achieve our collective mission. So the last piece then is just a little bit of enforcement, and again, you'll hear oftentimes about the guards information-led or intelligence-led, and certainly we've adapted our approaches. You talk about being agile in your processes, so you can see the rich data that's available across the road safety landscape. So certainly we're trying to leverage the data to see, okay, where can we best deploy our resources? So at the end of the presentation, I'll give you just an overview as to our policing plans for the upcoming October Bank Holiday weekend. But I suppose, really, and it's been echoed previously, the overarching piece, and again, we did a campaign with various communities throughout the summer, and the campaign was a slowdown campaign. And really, when the people asked us, what exactly would you want me to do? And there was personalities, and what we tried to approach was, okay, and I take on board the point that was made, listen, you won't necessarily change behaviours by going into schools at a young age, but maybe people of influence can. And, in fairness, I think there was a huge sentiment because, as I said, we've all been affected by it. If you're to walk around the room here now, I see all the communities, and someone knows somebody who's been adversely impacted either by a serious injury or a fatality in the road. In my own community at home, we've had it, and really, I've seen firsthand the devastating aftermath of it, okay? So certainly all of the ambassadors that we spoke to were absolutely supportive, saying, what can I do? And I think our central message, and again, it's to echo the themes of today, was the one simple message that we would say and encourage the people was to actually slow down. And I think that statistic around the reduction in speed and the impact that can have on fatalities is a really important one. And I suppose that would be one of our key messages, again, that's going out across our enforcement operation for the weekend. So we can see in terms of the Go Safe zones, we've had a huge expansion in the number of zones now, so I think we're up to the latest figure is almost 1,500 zones. And again, we've adopted our approach there to see, on a needs-must basis. And again, that's engagement with communities to see, you'll always hear the anecdotal stories, oh, well, I see them on such and such a road and I don't see them on others. So now we've adapted to that to see, okay, where is the need? And again, engaging with local communities to make sure that they have an input to see where can we best deploy this resource. So again, you can see up to 1,500 now is the figure. That's a July figure. So next slide, please. Yeah. So we can see again, was spoken of, huge level of compliance in those areas. And I think it may be to see, again, you'll hear a narrative of all shooting fish in a barrel or here and there. But actually, that is modifying behaviour. And I think if it's indicative of anything, it is what technology works. Technology works, and it is hugely effective, and it's demonstrable. It's evidence-based that these have a real impact, and they do change behaviour. Next slide, please. So again, that in terms of the various compliances in comparison with the various speed indicators, and I would see the greatest rate of compliance in our 100-kilometre zones. Again, Go Safe, I suppose it is something we're striving towards, and it was really in terms of Velma's presentation. We are working really closely with the RSA to see how can we harvest all the data, because it's a data-rich environment. I think the whole roads policing area is something that's a really data-rich environment, and again, we're trying to manage those challenges whereby we can pull all that information together to really harvest good intelligence-led products whereby we can have a real impact to drive the road safety message. Next slide, please. Again, very interesting here, and it was something that struck me that 88% of those detected were not detected again within 4 years, and 98% of those with 2 detections not detected again within 4 years. So again, I think it supports the narrative that this enforcement does work. And I suppose I was struck again by, I think it's important to bear in mind, and some of the other speakers alluded to it, we were moving office last week, and I came across an old photograph from 2004, and the front page of the Irish Times carried a story lauding the success of the road safety strategy, when in that year we 374 people killed on the roads. So I think it is important to bear in mind that, yeah, absolutely, we're not sitting here to pat ourselves on the back and to say that we've done our job, but certainly the trends are indicative that we are making progress in that. And I think that is something to bear in mind for all of the people who are putting their shoulder to the wheel in the area, that, yeah, we are making a difference and we are striving towards, yeah, ambitious goals, we accept that, but certainly if you look at the longer term picture and the trends, we are making real progress in that direction. So Again, some of our, I won't dwell on the speed enforcement, we've had a lot of statistics, but certainly just to say, you know, our Go Save operate a minimum of 7,500 hours per month. They averaged, between 2016 and 2019, there was approximately over 8,000 per month, or 270 per day. And now we're up to over 9,000 per month, or 300 per day nationally, okay? Again, some of the enablers that we would see, graduated fines that have been spoken to by other speakers, minimum suspension, license plate and standards enforcement. Again, that's an issue for us in terms of, you know, the standardisation around, particularly in respect of motorcycles, obfuscation of letters, and that can be challenging for us. We're looking, there are areas we're looking at. Visibility, technology, average speed cameras. So again, what we're talking about here is very much a collaborative approach to see what areas can we improve on. And you know, it's not, last week I was in another forum and we spoke that this is not an area where the guards, no more than anyone, is going to do it alone. There's a collective responsibility here, and I think that's a really important message, that it's not just any one agency is going to be able to deliver this, but a multi-agency response. So again, we can get an overview of the detections nationally, and you can see in the main significant increases in enforcement activity right across the country. I suppose mobility has been really transformative. I alluded to it earlier on, certainly for our frontline personnel, to move from a paper-based scenario. So war on paper is probably a good description of it. So it's just to move into a space of where we're kind of once and done, okay? So roadside, at their fingertips of the members, and to get the relevant details, driving licence details, location, so on and so forth. So it has been transformative. Currently we have just short of 8,000 mobility devices issued to our members nationwide, and all our roads policing personnel are equipped with mobility to be able to manage the fixed charge notice. So you'll see here just a sample of some of the screenshots which is done. And again, it is just, I suppose, capability, you know, certainly in comparison, we know that from speaking to other police services internationally, you know, that certainly they're quite envious of the capability that mobility has brought to us, and it's something that we're very happy with. And certainly we're not going to stand still. Again, as I say, hopefully it will evolve over time. Again, the use of ANPR, it's attached to the mobility device, and we're currently piloting ANPR with a view, probably I would think, to again enhance, you know, intelligence-led or targeted-led operations around specific dynamics. And I think there's huge capability there for us to focus on certain mapping, I suppose, against emerging kind of threats or trends, that we can do targeted type of enforcement activity with the use of ANPR. So again, we think that that's going to be hugely beneficial to support us. So again, just some of the capability. I think there was some furore here. You can see in one of the speed cameras, and to be able to pick up a speeding motorist from a distance of over 1 kilometre. So again, I suppose just an example of the technology, and I suppose the embracing of technology that we've had to try and keep pace with it, you know. And I think it has been, certainly one of the challenges has been to just set up how we would set up our roads policing units for success, and that has been part of that process. So again, you can just see that the impact had mobility to move away from paper-based, and I think the latest figures up in the region of in excess of 90% of our FCNs are issued via the mobility. There are some challenges in terms of driving under the influence and so on, in terms of note-based note-taking, but by and large, most of our frontline personnel now will issue fixed charge notices via the mobility device, which is, as I say, has been transformative. I'm just going to move into the area of the intelligence-led policing, and I have to acknowledge, I suppose, the input of my colleague John Moore, who's here today. And I suppose just in the afternoon you will get an opportunity, where they're here in the front, some of them in their white shirts, some of them in their blue, but it will be an opportunity maybe to ask, and people may not be in a position to ask questions in the next session, but certainly if we're around, just to ask questions and engage with us here, we're happy to answer any questions. So I suppose we wanted to move to an intelligence-led policing model to support, direct and inform roads policing operational plan for the October bank holiday weekend. So intelligence-led policing, you'll hear a lot of commentary about it. And I suppose our objective was to reduce serious injury and fatal road traffic collisions through the intelligence-led detection of intoxicated driving, other lifesaver offences, deployment of intelligence-led high-visibility patrols, and objective aligned to our Garda Síochána Act. And when we talk about lifesaver offences, speeding is very much to the fore of that. And I think that would be our key priority, certainly in tandem with today's launch and the Minister's announcement. We'll be focusing very much on speeding offences over the bank holiday weekend. So it's... intelligence-led policing was identified as a key enabler. So terms of tackling crime and preventative policing, the policing plan commits that in Garda Síochána proactively anticipating and addressing crime, including new and emerging crime trends, utilising effective information-led policing approaches, and specifically to cultivate an information-led service using data and technology to drive efficiencies, effectiveness and decision-making. So, next slide. So, Professor Jerry Ratliff is a proponent of intelligence-led policing, and I suppose a good description of it is intelligence-led policing emphasises data analysis and crime intelligence as a pivotal to an objective decision-making framework that prioritises crime hotspot, repeat victims, prolific offenders and criminal groups. It facilitates crime and harm reduction, disruption and prevention through both strategic and tactical management, deployment and enforcement. And I suppose just to give you some reassurance there, the references to crime, we would read that in a roads policing context. So in terms, you'll see some of the later analysis whereby we could see repeat incidents of drink driving, drug driving, serious and fatal collisions. So we harvest all that data with a view to saying, okay, where best can we deploy our data, bearing in mind, linked into a kind of a tasking coordinating process, okay, so whereby we can use best deployment of our resources to have the maximum output. So again, we would see the crime is highly concentrated in terms of place. A disproportionate amount of crime is experienced by a small segment of the population, and a small proportion of offenders commit a large component of crime. Okay, so as part of the process, we undertook an analysis of the last 12 years, national, regional and divisional level, serious and fatal road traffic collisions and detected intoxicated driving offences. Okay, so we can see, we know that October is a weekend of high volume traffic on our roads, with people going to enjoy the October bank holiday weekend. Okay, so what we've done is we've identified from our analysis that the highest risk time for fatal or serious traffic collisions for the previous 12 years in the October bank holiday weekend is between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. The highest risk period for intoxicated drivers for the period in the previous 12 years is between midnight and 3 a.m. The highest risk days are between Friday between 12 and 6, Thursday between 3 and 9 p.m. and Saturday between 9 and 12, or 9 and 9. So we disseminated our intelligence via hotspot matting. I'll rip through it. You'll see it visually. These documents would have went down to each of our divisions, and just to allow them to build their policing plan for the October weekend based on the interpretation of our analysis. So again, we can see as kind of a scoring matrix, and our assessment was done per 100,000 or per 10,000 of population. So you can see the top 10 divisions there based on the number of arrests per 10,000 over the previous 12 years of bank holidays, and the number of collisions also. So then they get an accumulative score, which gives them the risk placing in the matrix. Okay, so certainly you'll see I have some figures. This is a replica of an operation we done last August, and whilst again, you know, you need to caution to say, listen, but certainly the indicators of that is that it is quite successful, and I'll show you just the figures later on. So again, this is part of the analysis, and these are the 10 divisions that we've identified as being the most at risk for the October bank holiday weekend. So okay, so this is the August bank holiday weekend, and again, in comparison to 2021, we had 1 fatality versus 6 in 2021, and serious injury collisions were 27 versus 15 this year. And I suppose anecdotally, what we did here in the feedback, we actively engaged with our frontline personnel, and they would indicate that really this was really helpful to them in knowing where they can deploy the resources. So certainly we're enthused about it. We're not saying that it's a silver bullet, as someone else said, but certainly we think there is scope for further development with this type of analysis. So again, that's again, we have some messages there, but I suppose our big message in tandem with the other speakers is that we just encourage people to slow down for the bank holiday weekend. And just, I'll wrap it there. I'm slightly over time, I think, and to leave time for questions. But genuinely, we're very grateful for the opportunity to come and to speak with you today, and say we're very much open for business. And if you have particular ideas that maybe you're not more comfortable in the open forum, that certainly we're going to be around for the day, and happy to meet with you and discuss if there's any concerns you may have. So listen, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sean, for those insights into technology and intelligence-led policing. So we are going to have a question period now. We're going to cut it down to 15 minutes. And somebody is going to find some way to tell us when they're online questions as well. So people online have been able to put in their questions, I think. And I'll invite members of the audience to raise their hand. We've got some roaming mics, so please identify yourself and pose your questions.
Hi, how are you? Darren McAdam O'Connell, coordinator for the Cork Transport and Mobility Forum. I'm trying to keep this short, and I'm aware that I'm really addressing 8 different speeches here. So just to kind of sum up a two-part observation I have. We seem to see that an awful lot of speeding is done by people who feel very entitled. They tend to be better off and feel that they're better drivers and that they've never had an accident and that it'll never happen to them and they're not the problem, it's somebody else is the problem. So there are 2 observations or questions for that. One is not all deaths due to dangerous driving are via collisions. There's vastly more deaths from the people who are discouraged from walking or cycling, who feel they must drive. So a lot of the deaths from dangerous driving are deaths from heart disease, cancer, from stroke, from activity foregone, and from the pollution of driving because people don't feel safe. And I think that's a message that we get to get out, that is there any way we can get the message out that if you're driving fast, even if you don't have an accident, if you make people feel unsafe on the road, you are still costing lives. And the second thing is in regards with enforcement and the very welcome increase in the fines. Where you have that very well-off, entitled subset, is there a danger that unless we have the Norwegian coupled with the Finnish level of fines, that we really need to be thinking about points and removing licences rather than monetary fines if we're seeing that there's a disproportionate skew amongst those who are speeding towards the more affluent sector of society? Thank you.
So, Guru, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. Is this one? Yes, it's working. In Norway, the combination of fines and penalty points is working because you can't, if you are well off, you can't pay your way out of it. If you speed frequently, you will eventually lose your license. In Norway, we do not. Someone mentioned that you can have fines regarding of your income. We do not have that at the moment on speeding. I know there has been discussion about it because we do have that when driving under the influence on alcohol or drugs. And then the fine can be equivalent to the 1.5 months of salary. So it's high. And just to give an example, quite recently we introduced alcohol limits on motorized, what's the English word? Scooters, yes, the small new introduction mobility vehicles. And we had huge problems with people using them in the weekends and at night, and almost everyone who was brought to the emergency services were under the influence of alcohol. Then we had introduced the same limits for alcohol as in driving a car. And I think during the first month there was at least 2 or 3 people who were fined equivalently to 8,000 euros for going by these pedelecs. And that's really hurt. So if you could do something like that on speed, that would be, I think it will be very deteriorating for those who don't really care, because that's high fines, really high fines.
Anybody else want to comment? Ron?
Yeah. I think one of the things is that we know that speed reduces freedoms Right, and there's a very interesting thought here about the freedom to do things. We had a conference last week, and one of the speakers was Professor Danny Dorling, a renowned professor of geography and looking at social interventions. And he said that one of the most effective intervention in the UK in the last decade to reduce inequality was a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Because, again, if we know that speeding reduces the freedom for people to walk and cycle, then setting the wrong speed limit endorses limiting and suppressing the ability for people to walk and cycle. So we've got to get these right? And that endorsement of what we believe is a legal, decent and correct maximum speed in our public spaces, I think is key to that.
Okay, thank you. So, next question.
Michael Noonan, the Irish Motorcycle Association. Just an observation. The presentations were quite good from a general point of view, especially the live data, which would be current as against historical data. But what came across very simply is the Norwegian example of the standardised limits. This country sets limits by local authority jurisdictions. And as an example, I was in Coot Hill yesterday on a road, 10 foot wide with grass in the middle, had a speed limit of 80k on it. A single lane carriage. There is complete inconsistency in the speed limits around the country. And as the UK presentation shows, if you're accustomised to being able to do 80 on a 10-foot road down the country and you're on the motorway, your thought process is going to change. As somebody does a lot of mileage, your brain readjusts to what you're travelling at. So unless the mindset changes, so there needs to be a national average for down the country that will then start to get people used to operating at certain speeds. And that's coming from somebody who does 160,000 K per year. So I see a lot of inconsistency around the country in spots where even the speed vehicles can be located. Sometimes they're not relevant to the location that it could be in. So an overall national thought process is better than an individual local left down to national, the local authorities, because there's gross inconsistency there, and that may help for the rollout stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can look at the example of France with the lowering of the rural speed limits and the success that achieved in fatality and injury reduction. Unfortunately, there was a huge popular kickback against it, so now it's been decentralized again. So yeah, I mean, having consistency is obviously important, isn't it? Okay, more questions?
Thank you. Stand up. Michael Coleman. I'm a management consultant with KPMG, currently working for the RSA. Hopefully I'm not the only person in the room who was staggered by a number that Velma Burns presented to us, and that was not 1, not 2, but 3% of drivers said that they could not be dissuaded from speeding. 3% of drivers, ladies and gentlemen, is about 85,000 drivers. 85,000 is the capacity of Croke Park when it's full. I think we need something like that as an image to start portraying the seriousness of the problem that we're facing.
So, Liz, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. Sorry, Liz, here you go. Well, I think we've heard a lot of kind of frightening statistics today. I mean, our research is showing that there is a total kind of blasé attitude to speed limits generally. People who are otherwise law-abiding are admitting to breaking the speed limit by 10 k per hour. There's the lower limit of 50 and the higher limit of 80. So that has to be challenged. As a society and as a community, we just have to challenge that by our publicity campaigns, by conferences like this, that people are so used to speeding and have normalised it as part of their driving behaviour that they are admitting to that in a survey. So I think the figure you said, there are recidivist drivers. There are people who are reckless to their own safety, reckless to the safety of others. And that's a very key message that we have to challenge in this strategy if we are to kind of really kind of make this a people's project. I really think in terms of persuading our community that we have to change our behaviour, all of us. And I mean, it's not just, you know, the drunk driver, it's not just the speeder, as we have called them. It's everybody in society to just take collective responsibility for safety on our roads and for living in a safer, more enjoyable, you know, a livable community. So I think that the statistics that have been shared here today, both from on Garda Síochána, from Velma, our own research team, and from TII, it's that the head-on collisions. I mean, that is just so important that people realise that such a high proportion of people are being killed in head-on collisions on our rural roads network. So it's all been very useful.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to one of the observations in regard to the fines, and it is actually tied in to also that 85,000 figure. The Minister and RSA welcomed the announcement on the doubling of fines, but part of the action within the road safety strategy is just not to stop at the fines, it's actually also to review the penalty points. Because, if I picked up correctly, the observation was that you know, there is maybe a small section of people, road users, who believe that they can buy their way out of trouble and just pay the fines. But actually, when poor behaviour is enforced through penalty points, then you do lose your licence, and that is also in Garda Síochána's factual detection rate. Demonstrated, and Sean demonstrated that actually when people are detected, they do actually change their behaviour for the better. So it is important that the penalty points part of the enforcement isn't forgotten about here, and we have, RSA have benchmarked other countries, and there is more work to be done in that regard. Thank you.
Okay. So we've got time, I think, for one more question before we take a lunch break.
Yeah.
There's one over here.
Hi, Art McCarrick from Motorsport Ireland. I just had a query, and there's been some fantastic information, and it kind of struck me that reducing speed doesn't necessarily reduce all the risk, and I was just wondering if any of the panel members have any evidence that a higher level of driver testing helps in addition to this. I'm thinking of, and it's probably 14 or 15 years since I did my driving test, but it's quite possible that a newly qualified driver in Ireland may not have driven on a rural road, may not have done driving at night time, may not have even driven in wet or poor conditions. And is there, I suppose, the opportunity for a two-prong approach in addition to this fantastic work which has been presented to us? And is there any examples? I know Finland is often cited. You have to do, 2 or 3 years before you get your full license and an afternoon on a skid pan. But there's, I suppose, addressing the symptoms, and then the title of today, risk factors and interventions, that would strike me as a critical area that also needs to be looked at. I don't expect all the panellists to have the answers, but it's just more an observation more so than anything. It wasn't really mentioned today, and with regards to the information that Suzanne and Alistair put out there, head-on collisions on rural roads, poor conditions, it strikes me as something that needs to come into play.
So I think Sam would like to comment on that.
Thank you. And it's just when you refer to the skid pans, one of the actions in the road safety strategy is incorporating hazard perception within the driving test. And that is something that, yes, other countries have that already, and so that's why one of the actions are there to actually implement that hazard perception testing, and that hopefully then that does at minimum give road users who may not be familiar with rural environments, but at least it equips them at minimum with the theory of how to respond if there's flooded roads or if there's icy conditions that you might not necessarily find in an urban environment, but you'll find out in the rural environment.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there. We've unfortunately run out of time, and I imagine some people would like their lunch. So some guidance here. It's now about 10 past. Can I suggest that we resume at 1:45? Is that okay? So 35 minutes, little over 35 minutes for the lunch break. Thank you all very much. I'm sure if you have further questions, you can approach the speakers and ask them for their views on your issue. Thank you.